The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone to our hour of focusing on our New North rebrand, a discussion with Tobin Lehman, our principal of New North, and John Moorman, lead designer. Thanks so much for joining us. Here are some things we're going to cover today, really coming to the brand decisions, discussion around the old brand and how we came up with our new brand, specifically focusing on the brand canvas, visual identity, and then how we implemented our new brand. At the end of today's session, we'll have an audience Q&A. So throughout today's discussion, be thinking of any questions or topics that we didn't cover so that we can answer your questions at the end of today's session. So Tobin and John, what is brand?
Wonderful. Well, I'll start off a little bit here with this. And so this is a unique project because we are talking about rebranding. We're talking about rebranding our own brand. Right? So branding is work that we do. So doing it for ourselves is a little bit of a challenge. But for us, brand is the gut feeling that a customer has about your product or service. And so it is not a thing you do. It's not a logo. It's not a mantra, but it's really what that feeling the customer has about your company, your product or service. John, you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think just to kind of pile onto that, we'll be looking a lot at the visual side, and I'll be talking to that quite a bit, but that is kind of a misunderstanding. The logo is a part of it. It's a big part, but the brand as a whole, as Tobin said, is that gut feeling which involves a lot more. So we have this slide here if you want to speak to that.
Yeah. So when we talk about brand at New North, and specifically for this webinar, we're going to really hone in on the visual aspect of things. But just to kind of start at the 10,000 foot view of where we go, we think about brand, we think about all these elements, your mission, vision, your core values, your USPs, your visual identity, your voice. And this is a document we call the brand canvas, which is basically a strategic one sheet that allows you to kind of see your business in a snapshot, mission, vision, core values, USPs, even into your offerings, both products and services, and then how you bring those products and services to market through various channels, and then ultimately ending on the far right side with your customer demographics. Who are they, who they participate in? So this is our brand canvas at New North. So this is where we started, but we're going to focus on just really that box today of visual identity, because that's kind of the glamorous part. When people think about rebranding, they see, this is the part you see. But really a brand effort starts all the way back at mission, vision, core values, getting alignment on your USPs, what you do, because that informs the greater process. So that's a bit of a high level there for brand for everyone.
Thanks so much for getting us started. So before we look at the new logo and colors, let's take a look at our current, or really our old palette, since we've implemented this new brand. What parts of this were significant to you?
It's a great question. So our brand, actually, our logo, if you will, New North, started back in 2012. And so we're coming up on almost 10 years since that logo's been around. Actually, if I'm doing my math right, it could be a little bit longer than that. But the idea of, actually, I didn't even think about it. Actually, some of the team members brought it to me saying, hey, like, when are we going to do a brand refresh? When are we going to think about this? And I thought, oh, there's something wrong with the logo. So for me, it was a bit of a process to work through and say, well, maybe we are ready for that process. So, obviously there's sentiment in terms of starting a business, and this logo has fared us well over time. But I think through conversations helped me realize that there's things I like about it. There's things that go into it, things that had meaning for me in this with some of the elements and things. But overall, I was, later than convinced that, yeah, it is time to kind of do a new update here. So looking at, the colors, the way we got through those, sorry, real quick, is kind of thinking about, we loved blue. I've always loved blue. I'm wearing blue background. Blue's big for me in that sense, but having the highlight colors and really this idea of the peak, which is an element we'll talk more about today, is really about aspirations. People ask me a lot, like, what does New North mean? And I wish there was a great story to this. So if you're, as you're listening to this webinar, you're some of the few that are hearing the story, there really isn't much meaning behind it besides the fact that it's about aspiration. It's about guiding someone in a new direction towards a new destination. So that's the story, basically. There wasn't like a mountaintop epiphany or anything like that, but really having a cool name URL that made sense and really trying to point people towards something greater as a growth agency. So John, you kind of walked into this brand a little bit. What's your take on the older brand?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, like you had said, there's this sentimental value to it, and while there wasn't necessarily like this massive meaning or huge take on from that angle, there is some internal meaning that kind of got you started on this direction. So there's going to be that attachment, and that attachment I think is important because it kind of marks, you know, the beginning of New North as a whole. So we'll get into that, but that's obviously some considerations when you're tackling something like a rebrand. We want to create on the visual identity side of the brand. We want to create something that's, you know, going to stand out as unique in the market and make an impact on people. So we want to make good decisions with that, with the direction we take. But their sentimental value is huge, and I think that's oftentimes overlooked. So to hang on to some of those elements, I think were really important going forward with it.
So of course, going into the redesign, what were your thoughts really as the client, but also the principal at New North?
Yes, it's unique. So I get to be in my client's shoes for this project, right? So my first thought ultimate was cost, right? Like I needed to know what this was going to cost us, because I know where our logo is and all the investment we've made, like environmental graphics and obviously the website. That's not that big of a cost, but really, what was the extent? Like, what was this really going to end up being, and how massive was it going to be? How much time does it take? I mean, this was being an internal project, so how long would this really take to get going? But as I shared earlier too, I was also just a little bit like, you know, do we really need it? Like, what's the value of it? And, you know, we'll talk about that near the end of the presentation today, but like, what are we hoping to get out of this? Like, besides just a cool new logo, maybe some new t-shirts, what would be the value we would receive from actually going through a branding effort? So that was a lot of my thoughts.
So John, you were responsible for a lot of the design updates, and really when the owner, your boss of a marketing firm, wants you to take on a project like this, like, is it exciting or possibly nerve-wracking? Can you share your feelings in going into this endeavor?
Yeah. So yeah, moving into brand, it's always exciting. The visual side of things, it can be very challenging, but it's fun to navigate through those challenges. Nerve-wracking, yes. I mean, your client in this case is also your boss, and you want something to represent, you know, him as the founder of the company, but also something that we can also get behind. So in that sense, there's a little bit of the added pressure to it. But it was a very exciting project. Once we started to get the ball rolling with it, I was thrilled to dive into it.
And from a design standpoint, what do you feel really was like the most helpful pieces of information that were gathered throughout the process? Like, was it that allowed you to zero in on design, color, font suggestions? What was really the most important?
So there was this, I think it ended up being a great balance, right? So Tobin had mentioned cost as an aspect, and that's going to be an aspect for any client going into brands. Overhauling a brand can be a huge undertaking. So that is in mind, but we also want to like hold on to that attachment. Again, we'll get into this later, but I think the initial thought that went into it, there is alignment with, you know, our mission and our strategy at New North. So I think it was kind of this redefinition of that rather than a complete overhaul of that. So doing something visually, going into a visually similar direction, but just refining that down and kind of establishing like a more fine-tuned direction on that. I think that's a double advantage, right? So we're revamping the brand as a whole. We're getting into looking like we're in a larger market space and attracting people into our brand. But at the same time, there's that cost saving side. You can see, you know, you'll see the colors we went into, kind of peeked at it. But Tobin and I are both sitting in front of a wall that's painted with the old colors, which we were able to recycle. So there's a lot of behind the scenes thinking that happens beyond, even on the visual side. when you're starting to think about that stuff. So all that went into the thought process there.
Yeah, and I would add something too before we move on is, John mentioned something in his last comment about, kind of like being part of the effort, right? And as New North has grown, I mean, this is, we're said a decade past the original logo. And so there was an element which was interesting to me just in, the company has changed, the company has grown. And so there was a necessity to kind of reshape, not just what the market might perceive us and kind of the aesthetic side, but going to those exercises, restating the mission, making sure that was aligned, restating the core values, like digging in and kind of opening the war chest, if you will, and kind of digging through there and saying, is this still all accurate? Is this right? And is this the best look and feel going forward for it? So yeah, it's like everyone loves the end product stuff and it's like, cool, but the reality is that end product is even more beautiful when you understand like the process that went through to get to that and has a greater meaning. And, sometimes you don't see that on the surface every time, but for the company goes through it, and even for the team, because again, the team is part of the brand effort, has great impact.
So getting into the visual identity of New North.
Sweet. So this kind of piggybacks on that last question. We'll get into the fonts. To answer that question, we kind of did with the color. There was some recycling. But before we get, you can keep on this slide, but just to speak to that color, we did do color, we kind of like a color exploration stage, and a little bit earlier than you usually see with a rebrand. Usually you kind of want to work black and white and conceptually, but I think it was really important to define the existing colors, and as Tobin mentioned, see if they line up with what we want to, and what we see or we envision for the company going forward as we evolve. So we did some of that exploration. We're looking into like purples and blues, which is pretty in line with like the tech industry and big brands. Greens, there's some growth aspects to that. Oranges, there's a lot of creativity that gives off. It's really diving into the color theory. Ultimately, we landed on yellow, which is a color we had previously. But yellow really screams like permanence and the intellectual side. So our expertise on as experts in the B2B tech marketing space. So I think that really like correlated with us quite a bit. And we were pretty much set. I mean, there was a lot of internal discussion and a little back and forth with it, but I think in the end, we all kind of were in agreement with pushing that forward. And contrasting that with this deeper color here, I think one of the things that, being a 10-year-old logo, is scaling back and not going too color heavy. So we went from 3 to 2 in that sense. But past the color exploration here, as you can see on the slide, we went into kind of like a typeface exploration. So doing that, we're looking at it in a very similar light. Like, what do we want? As we mentioned with brand a lot, the visual side, what people see, that's going to evoke feelings with people, and we want to make sure that we're picking something that resonates with us as well as with our audience. So while this isn't the final logo, we kind of had an idea of placement where we wanted things. One of the challenges that we heard and we were receptive of is that the old logo with the peak, this little element here, that compass element, being positioned above could be kind of confusing. It flowed a little bit. So we knew somewhat of how we wanted that layout or that orientation. But just strictly looking at the font, slab serifs, there's gonna be a sense of motion. And when we look at like bitter here, it invokes strength and boldness in the brand. You have Gaudi, which is gonna be like very traditional. It leans very heavy into a very literal meaning of that direction, that sense of direction, as it kind of invokes this like feeling of a compass or a map. Very unique, not necessarily in line, but it's always interesting to explore these kind of opportunities here. We have Cardo, similar to Gaudi, a little bit more impact and weight to it. We looked at Gotham. That's a very corporate font. You see that in a lot of brand identities. So there's a little bit of a generic side to that, but you do want to see that kind of treatment. I think it's always helpful. And then if you want to go to the next slide there, we were looking at, Lado is an existing element from our original brand. It has a little bit of that corporate feel that Gotham has. So I think that was a strength. We're growing, our client base is growing, and we want to kind of be more molded into that environment. So we have new clients. We want them to look at us at that level. We want to make sure that that's the vibe we're giving off. But we also wanted to avoid being generic. So ultimately, Lado was kind of what we ended up steering towards. There's also that cost savings side from a signage standpoint, a lot of marketing collateral. We had systems in place to kind of, in a way that we could, you know, had flexibility there, but we didn't have to overhaul a whole lot. And honestly, looking at all our options, these are just a few here. Lado was internally what was seen as the strongest. We have that punch in there where we're taking a bolder weight of that, which I think it feels a little bit more modern and clean now. And it still has a lot more character than something like a Helvetica or a Gotham. So we'll see later on. We did also tweak it and alter it to push it even lean more into our brand and what we wanted to look and the feel we wanted to give off. But that's kind of the font and color selection process there.
Yeah, and I'll add something just to talk about it from the client side. I mean, one of the big challenges we have with New North in this directional piece is not being seen as outerwear. Like, we don't want to be like a camping company, right? So like John talked about the font choice of the map, like there's a literalism that comes just from being north of the point that people tend to identify some of this with, you know, camping or exploration and things like that. So that was definitely one of the challenges in trying to pick a font that didn't go that direction, but was also unique and different enough that it allowed us to be standing out in the space. So I think John did a great job with kind of working through it, and ultimately, you know, decisions kind of come back. And Lado wasn't actually the typeface for the past logo, but it's a typeface we use internally as some graphics and things like that. So it kind of like picked up on the evolution that didn't happen and really kind of moved forward, which we liked, because it, again, kind of balanced cost, innovation, and all these challenges. Like, it actually did the job, and by circumstance, it was already in place, which was great.
Right. Cool. So we can go to the next one here. Yep. So the peak. So in between that, there's a lot of we're looking at, you know, you saw kind of a composition there on the type, but there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff happening. This is kind of a high level what we pare down to, but playing with the composition. So once we get there, there's a big process to get to that point. But part of that composition is the peak. The peak is a huge element of the logo itself, and one we decided to keep in place. I think it resonates with our brand very well. You know, I think there's a light meaning that went into it initially, and we just kind of were able to take it a step further, which was great. It's back to that evolution, not reinventing the wheel, because we have something that works. I think it was just something that needed to be a little bit polished and pushed further. You know, 10-year-old logo, so being able to update that and refresh the brand. So if you go into the next slide here. So some background, the peak is the core mark of New North brand. Alongside the name, we see visual cues to the compass and direction. When we're looking at the peak, and in general, we are an agile company. So there's constant change, right? So there's this movement that happens naturally. But what I wanted to hone in on is that when Tobin started this company back in 2008, it's always been a calculated direction that we've been headed towards, or that Tobin has kind of steered the ship towards. And the peak kind of symbolizes that, but to really inject a little bit more meaning, we ended up going a little bit deeper into that. Magnetic declination is that offset that you have to establish what true north is when you're looking at a compass. So it's not always, you know, what you think it is or what it appears to be. There's always a calculation that needs to go in. And I think that's highly representative of the kind of things that happen workflow wise in the office on a day-to-day basis, which was really unique. It kind of just came to the surface like that. On top of that, there's a timestamp element, because magnetic declination of Earth is constantly changing. The Earth magnetic field is constantly changing. So we were able to timestamp that and find, you know, in Frederick, in the area here, around that time, it had a magnetic declination of, you know, 10.7 degrees. To establish true north. So we decided that's, you know, that correlates really closely to the existing peak. It's not exact, but it's really close. We might be able to kind of take what is existing and just improve upon it, not change it, just tweak it and really inject new meaning into it, or emphasize that meaning. So if you go to the next one here, mapping that out, we basically took the general flow and style of the peak, added a very symmetrical, I mean, with the icon, we want the icon to stand out a lot on its own. So with that, you know, we were really refining some of the corners there and the symmetry in it to make sure that it was as polished as we could possibly get it. Because from an application standpoint, it's those micro details that people don't notice, but from a brand recognition standpoint, that's what sticks. So we really fine-tune that to a point that we have this new peak, and we actually started looking at it side by side. It's very close. There's a little shift to it, but now we have this, like, we're always pointing, and we've always been pointing towards the right direction with New North. And I think that's just a really cool feeling that we get out of this logo here. Let's go to the next one there. The previous logo, we had a lot of stripes in there. I don't think there was, like, you know, it was a stylistic decision. But even that, like, every little part of the logo, I want to make sure that has some kind of meaning, you know, not just to our clients, but also internally. We stick by 5 core values as a team, and that's something we review very regularly. So we scaled back the bars through the logo, and they're now representative of our 5 core values. So we have the compass keeping us on track, that arrow, the peak keeping us on track, and we have those 5 pillars that we can stand on along the way. Go to the next one there. Okay, so that kind of established the logo, the iconography for the brand. So it was really interesting because it feels a lot more polished, but side by side, it's not that far off, but there's a lot of these little details and meaning that we got to inject into it. And earlier we established that we decided to go with the Lado typeface. So if you go on the next slide, a typeface as a whole it gets you probably like 80–90% of the way there. Lado is very flexible. It's easily accessible. It's a Google font, which is great from an accessibility standpoint, working with clients or just putting it on collateral or marketing materials. So that flexibility is huge, not having to have licenses and all that per computer or user. But we wanted to give that, it's an open source font. We want to give it character. We want to give it the New North character. So part of that was, now we have the peak established, we have the typeface established. How can we push the typeface further? And ultimately, those 2 elements together are what are going to give us that final logo. So biggest thing is to just visually adjust the kerning for the best balance that we can get with the logo by default. So you can see the yellow behind the scenes there. That's if you just type it out. And there's this natural tightening or spacing out in some cases of the font. The terminals on like the T were readjusted to line up with the R. So there's these, like, again, these are these micro details that when you look at it, you know, from a client standpoint or an audience standpoint, that's not what they're going to see, but they're going to see something more harmonious and balanced at the end. They might not necessarily know why, but it's those subtle details that it's really important to polish and fine tune that. And then obviously the peak has a curved point. So I wanted to inject that into the typography itself. So you can kind of see that visually mapped out here. And it gives it's kind of 2 purposes. It gives it a very visual, similar feel to the peak, the typeface itself, when we do that. But where we're doing those curves are all on like the top left sides of the characters. So naturally it's pointing towards the peak. So there's this visual flow that happens when you look at the peak and the logo type together as the final logo. Again, these subtle differences, but it's how people see it, right? They see it, they have a feeling, it's giving them a feeling. And oftentimes when you go into those micro details, they don't know the feeling, they can't express the feeling, why they're feeling that way, but it's going to give them that feeling. And it's that extra step that gets you there. So that was we were able to push that to a point we were happy with that final type. So here, the next slide. Ultimately, this is how we pieced it all together. So we keep the visual flow going to the peak, our core piece to the company, and our core mark. We have those matching corners, the strong contrast for boldness. You know, the color, we talked about that, the trust, strategic, tech, intelligence, expertise, intuitive. You'll see the final color in a second. that little slant, that cut through. I wanted to emphasize even more of that agile nature of the company. There's a constant shift happening, and it's for the better. We constantly are improving and changing. So that's in there. And then as a whole, the architecture is stable, precise, strong, everlasting, and grounded. It's usually mostly flat bottom here. So that's kind of how we had the final layout there. And I think the next slide is with the full color. So here's the full colors. Ultimately, the blue there was pretty much right on with our existing dark blue. A little different, but that way, we have our interior office completely painted this color. We don't have to revisit that, and it's a strong color. It contrasts super well with the yellow. What didn't contrast as well was that electric blue, that third color, so we removed that out. And then the peak, we went to a little bit more of a gold. We shifted that a little bit, which you can see here. It helps it pop even on white backgrounds, which was important. We wanted to make sure that the logo was just as flexible as it was like having an impact visually. So that's that. And then I think if you go to the next slide, we can actually just see the whole logo blowing up. So there it is. That's kind of how we got there. That kind of distills that process down in a very, a light way. Those are a high level kind of take on the different steps that we took to get to this final logo.
Yeah, and I would add, just as reflecting as the client being through this process, and so John and the team, I basically popped into meetings like I would as a client. They were bringing me to speed on this. I mean, going through the process, there was these decisions, these conversations, and so I think when we think about Rebrand, we bring so much baggage to the table of all these things it's going to encompass. But the process was so well done that the outcome is so strikingly different, but so much of it retained. Like it's interesting to look at it now, just reflect on things. So many things are retained. The peak is retained. A font that we were kind of using internally is retained. The colors aren't that different, but you put the two logos together, I mean, in a sense, it's almost night and day. And so you get really this emphasis of what you can do with what you've got and really work forward from it. And so for me, it's very successful in terms of getting all the pieces in play and kind of coming up with something brand new. And I'm stoked. It's a great logo.
So talk to us about going live with the new logo and branding.
Yeah. So going live. So the question is, now you got this new logo. What do you do from here? So this is where the project came back into my lap. So John and the team created the visual assets, and it's like, well, how do you then take a logo live? And this is actually a much bigger conversation. I'm going to give a quicker kind of view of this and kind of go through it. But you have the next slide, just so we can kind of press in a little bit here. The question really is like, well, what's this really involve? Like, what does this take? And so I would say from our perspective, I mean, we do this work for clients as well. Ours might have been a little longer because it's kind of the cobbler's children waiting for shoes. Like we prioritize some client work ahead of it sometimes. But we do it for client works, typically going from all the way from brand canvas to logo, like starting really high, is roughly around 3 months to do something like that. And so the rollout part of it is really where the question mark comes in. So we could have the logo, the brand, everything kind of lined up and nice documentation. Making it live depends a lot on what is out there. Like what do you need to do? If you've got vehicle wraps, if you've got thousands of out of home appliances, whatever. I mean, we do a lot of tech work. Sometimes it involves products. Sometimes it involves installation. Some things are just digital, not a big deal. So a lot of it has to do with the factors. So what we did, I think it's the next slide here, is we went through you kind of assessing the collateral, right? Like how many things did we really need to touch, right? You think about your business, how many things is your logo on? You're not counting shirts, not counting the website, those things are obvious, but really where are all of those elements in the process? And that's really the only way you can start to adjust and kind of understand how long it takes to actually launch one of these projects. So, kind of getting all of it together, and then you've got really, once you understand that, there's kind of 3 modes, right? And I think this is where the conversation gets really long, so we'll try to keep it short. But you've got kind of 3 ideas. One would be a subtle, no frills, we just roll it out when we've got it kind of thing. Update the logo on the website, update an email or a signature here and there. no fuzz. If everything doesn't match by the first day, like no big deal, we'll get to it, right? Smaller brands typically do something like that, or maybe products that have less visual aspects to it, consultants, things like that. If you've got a high exposure brand, you can't really do that. So like an app, for example, in software, you wouldn't want to have like one page with one logo, another page with another logo. That wouldn't make any sense. So the second way of doing is what I would call just like a coordinated launch, right? We're going to switch everything on a certain day. Now the process for that is actually then organizing all of those pieces and understanding where they go and the rollout. So this kind of one day, rollout involves actually like 3 weeks, 4 weeks of work getting to that one day, right? So how do you roll an entire brand out in one day? Well, you coordinate it, right? So I think the next slide here we'll talk about shows a little bit. You're gonna maybe jump to the sheet for me. It's really about, like, again, assessing the items and then prioritizing them. So we opted for in our brand a one-day rollout, which basically means we're gonna roll out the entire brand in one day. So what does that mean? It means like everything changes at one given time. Now, some things you can schedule, some things you can't, some things you can prepare. So in the background, we're making all the new social graphics. We're making all the new e-signatures, updating all of our PDFs and Word documents. Basically, all the update process is happening, over a span of 3-4 weeks. Like taking a month, basically, to kind of coordinate all these pieces. And that comes from obviously understanding the assessment of all those elements. And we're not quite seeing the slide yet, but we can get there for it or get the document going. So we assess all these elements that we need, and that helps us prioritize it. So we prepare all these documents week over week, and then we basically pick a day. And so for us, here we go, thank you. For us, that day was going to be September 28th, which is the anniversary of New North. So our 13th birthday was going to be our rollout. So actually what ended up happening is, you can see here, if we scroll to the top of the document, you can see we have all the elements. We audited everything from the website to our social channels, Google My Business, email signatures. You can see as we kind of scroll on the list here, we just indexed everywhere we found the logo, all the way down to the bottom of the list where it gets into even our building signage, our Slack channel, employee handbooks. Everything is just kind of audited on this list. Then we prioritized. And so for us, our launch on September 28th was going to involve priorities 1 and 2. So it's priorities 1, 2, and 3. Priorities 3 ended up being the higher cost items, right? We could live without maybe not repainting the office, for example, or like we have actually some branded carpets we maybe weren't going to buy right away, but maybe some shirts and things like that we'd wait in this process to do. And so every business has their own rationale for some of that. It could be cost control, could just be seasonal or whatever it may be. But that was kind of our process. So in the meantime, we're preparing all these assets, and really we planned. For us, this is about maybe a 30 to 40 hour effort broken across our entire team. So we actually, it was more of an internal kind of celebration. We took half the day on the Monday beforehand and just started rolling out all these items. So 9 a.m. on September 28th, the entire brand was live. The entire online presence was completely changed over. Internal documents were ready to go. And we basically were operating in the new brand, kind of in that one shot. And that's the way we recommend it, specifically because there's so many elements, and this is just a kind of typical simple way of monitoring it, but it's really how you go through that process. The third way, which I haven't mentioned yet, is very similar to this, but it's even taking the brand launch and then maybe making the brand launch itself a marketing effort. Do press releases, maybe an event or a party. We're still on the tail end of COVID right now. Is this webinar is being recorded, so I don't know what it would be like if you watch this webinar 2-3 years from now, but an in-person event seems like logistically kind of challenging. PR about a branding agency launching a new brand is, seems a little redundant in some ways. Don't they do that all the time? No, it's not really newsworthy. And so we opted for this to really push out and kind of get our brand out there, get to the process, get it up, and really start using it to level up. And that's really the process we used.
So share with us some of the results of the new brand rollout.
Right. So if you remember from the first part of the conversation, my question as an owner was really, what's this going to do for us? Right. I mean, I'm in marketing. We're all in marketing. We do this for a living, and we sell this stuff. But even when you're kind of pressed with the idea of like, I really want to invest in this. I mean, this is multi-$1,000 investment for this effort. What am I hoping to get out of it? And so brand, speaking as a strategist, is one of the most intangible things to measure when it comes to marketing. You can, we can measure pay-per-click, we can measure emails, but what impact does a brand really have for you? Well, you can measure it, and it's actually just a little bit different way of going about it. So I would say, this webinar is here just the first kind of week or so into October. What has happened now in launching a brand like in a week, right? You think that's a week, you just launched a brand a week ago. Like, what kind of came of that process? Well, I'll tell you a couple things. One, the quality of leads have changed. For a business like ours, we receive a handful of leads in every given week. The number of leads that have come in and the perspective of those leads has grown. Bigger leads, bigger deals, opportunities. So the brand itself has started to demonstrate that the new look, the new perspective, the freshness, even the intangibles has positioned our company in a better light. Even as a marketer, I still find that encouraging and exciting, that actually a brand project does have tangible benefits. Now, you can't look at it on a dashboard or a spreadsheet, but you ultimately will see it in the ROI. And we've seen that in our own work, even more specifically around messaging and aesthetics, but brand absolutely does matter. We've seen two similar type companies, similar size, similar offerings, one that has an outstanding brand presence, maybe custom photography, great logo, things like that, and one that's kind of pulling stuff off of iStock and templates, and they just are 10x the results from a lead gen perspective. So brand absolutely does matter, and we're starting to see the results, and I assume this is going to continue going forward as we elevate, and just the perspective even our HR candidates are bringing to us now and being able to work in. So even in a short week, we've seen just an interesting change in the perspective of leads. National, international clients, which we had some of those previously, but I think it's really leveled us up in terms of where we are.
All right, so now we'll open it up for some audience questions. Any questions, you can go ahead and place them in the navigation bar section. We'll give a few minutes to see some come through. And we've got one here, one so far. I think a couple people are thinking. We'll start with this one. So the question is, in the process of making decisions, how did you come to a collective consensus from the team? Obviously, there's probably lots of opinions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a good one. John, what was the experience like for you? Like in kind of the decisions of narrowing things down? We looked at a lot of fonts, color choices, things like that, maybe from your perspective, and then I'll give mine.
Yeah, I think we're fortunate that we are a smaller company. I think that has a lot of benefits. There's not, this chain that you have to work through, and it's our company. So, we have a great culture here. And this was very much a team approach when we were doing this brand. It took a lot from everyone, and everyone had that positive energy. But part of that process is, not jumping too far ahead. We're having important meetings along the process, a chance to explain directions or ideas that we might have before we start polishing those ideas. We kind of get them started. We have team buy-in, suggestions are happening. So, we talked about how this logo is an evolution of the existing brand that we had, but there's an evolution that happens in just the logo process itself. And that's all great. That also kind of goes to that agile nature, to be able to just, work as a team to refine this along the way, hugely beneficial, because we're able to, raise a flag up when we see an issue or something we might want to tweak. Or if we have doubts or questions about stuff along the way. And there was a lot of good, so behind the scenes, there was a lot of good constructive conversations around the direction, especially, I'm speaking more on the visual identity side than the brand as a whole, but I think the brand as a whole also had those constructive conversations. That was the biggest part, I think, small team and open communication along the way.
Sorry, talking while muted. I think it was great. the interesting part for me was also, when the original logo was created, it was honestly created in a bubble. Like, it was myself just creating the logo, and then create the logo, but the team that helped me was an external team. So the decision process was uniquely mine alone, just the size of the company. So to me, there is an importance in the decision-making process we went through with this, because it did involve the team, even though I was ultimately giving some yay and nay decisions in it, to hear the feedback, to have the team kind of voice what was the stronger attributes or things that felt like were really needed, was in a sense relieving for me. I didn't have to make all the decisions, but also it helped kind of build, like I said, it was something we were creating together, which I think even itself as an exercise was really strong for the team to do. That's not the same in most corporate environments, but for us it was an ability to do that. But again, because it helped us all go back to the basics. What was the mission? What was the vision? What was the core values? And how is this visual identity going to really help us live those out, or even personify some of those values as you went through? And so for me, the exercise itself was really helpful, as well as helping building consensus, because we weren't just all saying like, I like blue, I like green. Like, we were all coming back to the real rationale behind everything.
So our next question is actually like a multi-part question. So I'll start with the first part of it. So obviously New North is a design agency. So we can see why new branding would be important to a marketing agency and design. But for technology companies with, we consider our brand, the audience member, considers their brand okay. Like, how important is it really to invest in making it better?
Well, I'll speak a little bit from this side. I mean, as I kind of mentioned, I was even a little skeptical, right? So the question itself has a little skepticalness to it. It's everything in tech. One of the things that we've seen time and time again with tech, and the expectation of technology is advancing. It's growing. It's, there's a phrase, leading edge tech. Like, there's not really like leading edge dry cleaning. Like, no one really cares, to a sense, like the job is done. But technology is different. Technology is expected to be growing and advancing and be, in a sense, pioneers. And so one of the biggest challenges is with tech companies that don't look fresh. They don't look like current. They might look dated. They might look homegrown. There's a list of adjectives I could kind of bring to the table here, but basic sense is that this is cutting edge technology. It should look cutting edge. And so that's not to say the aesthetics don't matter or matter the most, but in the sense they do. I've seen valuations of company be impacted by the aesthetics of the web page, even if the product wasn't that great. We see that in a lot of markets right now. So perception's reality in a lot of cases. I know it's one of your phrases, Dawn. It's like that's really what we talk about with brand, but it does have more to do with the other elements, like I said, mission and vision. But I think it's really important for tech companies, especially if they're trying to grow rapidly or change markets or products, to really think about brand as, almost like we think about websites every 3 years. I would think about brands every 3 to 5 as well.
Thank you.
John, do you have things to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you pretty much covered a lot of it. I think there was a time where that whole tech sector was a bit of like a Wild West kind of a vibe going on, but now, I mean, everyone knows what works, and you just look at the big brands and how much innovation is, how heavily or highly prized that aspect is. One thing that's on the tech side, especially, there's a lot of digital interaction happening. So user experience is a massive thing that all these tech companies are putting a lot of money and budget into, because people are becoming more and more impatient, and things are becoming more and more seamless. With that comes a strong brand presence and a good visual identity to kind of push people along. The brand, again, we talked about this, goes beyond the logo, but the whole visual side, the whole look and feel of whether it's on a piece of software, on a website. So that's hugely important. And usually what comes with that is a strong visual identity. So yeah, as Tobin said, 3 to 5 years even, it might have been more before, but there's constant iteration happening, and constant change happening, especially in the tech space, probably more so than other sectors. So I'd say it's almost more important in that space.
Thank you. Just checking on another question here. All right, so obviously this seems like it would be, aside from the expense of the project, what really is like the disruption, the cost that you really can't see like in the proposal? Like as a leader of a technology company, like how do I weigh the benefits and how do I decide if this is worth it as an undertaking?
It's a good question. It's a good question. That's what the point of this is, right? Be caught off guard. I think the thing you need to work on in this is almost like there's just a cost to it, right? Like you need to have the anticipation of it. Like you anticipate the fact that your car will eventually grow high on mileage, you'll need to replace it. I think many people think once they have a logo, they're done forever with this, right? It's like we have a logo. Why would we ever need to change it? So I think the first step is really just a mental expectation, which some companies have and some don't, is again that cycle. Like you should be on a cycle of replacing a website every 3 to 5 years. You should be in a cycle of at least tweaking, updating, and modifying your brand on the same thing. So with that being said, the cost factor should in a sense be anticipated, right? Would be the ideal answer. It's not really the way the world works in many cases, but that'd be my advocacy. The other side would be, there's a lot of cost to it. Like you almost have to jump in to figure it out. But like that brand audit that I showed that kind of went through all the different elements where the logo is being used, that is going to be huge from a cost perspective, because you may retain an agency like ours to do this project for you, which could include a lot of creation of digital assets, but there are going to be hard costs because you've got vehicle wraps or product stickers, or even if you let the brand exercise evolve into even USPs and elements of changing your product or service, right? Which can absolutely happen. So the cost is a real factor to think through. But I would also think of the brand not simply as buying a new set of clothes, right? It really is a longer term, more foundational play into the business to say, I'm going to invest in kind of re-energizing, kind of charging the battery, if you will, for the marketing efforts. I mean, we've seen companies pour thousands and thousands of dollars into like pay-per-click ads or billboards where the brand and message wasn't strong, right? It wasn't strong. And so you could have spent a third of the money with a better brand and received 3 times the results, right? So think of brand as almost like a force multiplier in a way. Like if it's not right, it's going to cost you more. If it's right, it's going to cost you less. And so that's where the cost of brand gets even trickier to understand, because if it's done really well, it's going to reap better benefits. Like almost everything will become better in that aspect because it's got clarity, it's got clarity of messaging, clarity of USPs. It's more impactful, it's more concurrent, it resonates with the kind of current visual culture, and there's so many benefits that stem with it, because it's not just like a new pair of shoes that you just walk the same path with. It's much different. So I can't give you a definitive answer on the total cost, but I think there's a lot of hard costs, but I think the other side is really balance what the potential benefit could be. And that requires consultation. And some businesses may or may not benefit as much from the initial impact of something like this, but I know if they do any kind of selling online, they'll absolutely benefit from it. If they use any kind of trade shows, any kind of elements where the visual component is being used. And there's some businesses we've worked with that have very little visual play, but that's not true in software. That's not true in hardware. Only in the consulting side does that really exist. And so, but they still use their website to sell. So not the direct answer, but hopefully a good one.
I think that was, I like that multiplier. That's a really good explanation in short with how it pairs with the other, pushes within the organization to grow. Because yeah, it can be hard to measure certain elements, but it's a perceived value. And when you're on a good site, have a good experience, it's a strong looking brand, it looks like a big company, there's a higher perceived value. And now it's up to the business owner and the employees to match that level. And so there's a tailwind that the internal team's responsible for, but it definitely raises the expectations, I think, for people. So you look at any brand that's growing. I've seen people that take shortcuts, in things like brand, and you see the fallout that happens as a result of that. And again, it's not necessarily something measurable, but there might be a competitor that's putting more effort into it, and they're inevitably going to grow. They're going to grow whether they want to just keep growing, grow to sell off the company. But that's where you just look at those companies and you see a lot of emphasis put into those things.
Thank you both. I think that's it for our question today. Well, thank you both for sharing, in-depth insights in terms of what it's like to undergo a logo and branding project. I think the thoughts shared today were very helpful for all. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope you'll join us again for future webinars.
Thanks so much, Don.
Thanks, Don.